FACT was born in the early 90s, based primarily on a FDA initiative to regulate our field. There was the 21 CFR, it was published late 80s, early 90s, a tiered approach to stem cell regulation. And we all in our field began looking at this and thinking that it was a bit frightening to have the FDA come in and start regulating our clinical transplant programs, our laboratories, our stem cell collection programs.
The whole point of FACT was that we were going to be inspected by the FDA. Then they weren't going to use their sophisticated inspectors. They were going to send in the people that did the inspection of the abattoirs. We didn't really want that.
History really repeats itself. 20 years ago, we were very much in a period in which there was great turmoil in healthcare. And the turmoil was created in a couple of different areas, not dissimilar from today. One is that because of the Clinton initiatives to deal with insurance and health reform, it made the conversations about cost something that people could talk about, and that never had happened before. And so all of a sudden, insurance companies were looking for centers of excellence in transplant. The second part of it related to regulatory oversight by the FDA. The FDA felt that it was important to investigate this new area of medicine in which bone marrow stem cells were being harvested and used for treatment. And they were promulgating some rules that were really quite onerous and would have hurt patient care.
And so we began to actually have a few conversations with the FDA in terms of the timing. When are they going to do this? What could we do to help ourselves regulate with intelligence and understanding of the field? And in fact, FDA were collaborative. We met with them. They basically supported the fact that if we actually established our own accreditation system, it would help them, and it would be less pressure on them to necessarily have to come in and look at every field, every program. And so with that initiative, we really began to establish this project.
I thought the whole concept of FACT was about the craziest thing I'd ever heard of. I was brought into it kicking and screaming. I thought that it was, while noble, silly to believe that we would be able to pull off something that had not been done anywhere else in medicine, much less in a very new and risky type of treatment at the time for patients that were in dire situations with their cancers. I think the notion that we could develop those standards, that we could recruit a volunteer force that then would be able to go out and inspect programs among our colleagues, and that we could actually get our facilities to pay for the privilege of this inspection was something that seemed insurmountable.
There were naysayers of all sorts at the beginning of this organization. There were naysayers on the outside, I think, who were just pretty quiet and just didn't participate. There were some who were very vocal and expressed their distrust and their disbelief that this was even possible. There was a board member who said, I don't know that this is going to work. People aren't going to pay money to do this. And then there were some too that said, if you don't keep the FDA out altogether, you will have failed. So they had, in a way, loftier goals than we could ever hope to achieve.
In the early time of FACT, we were in a windowless hotel room in Grapevine, Texas. And it was Sunday morning, and all the documents for FACT were spread out on the table. And I think we were talking about something like, what are the maximum number of foot-pounds of lateral pressure that a shipping container for stem cells can withstand? And there were things all over this, and you know, there was O'Reilly was there, and Kersey, and Champlin, and Parkman, and we were going through this, and in walks Don Thomas, and we were all kind of stunned. He said, "Well, I was just dropping by, and I wanted," and I said, "Don, you weren't dropping by. I know you weren't in Texas. Why are you here?" And he kind of smiled and he said, well, you know, if we don't do this right, someone will do it for us and they'll get it wrong. So I think that was the impetus for all the work that Phyllis, that Scott Raleigh, that Rick O'Reilly did, working one-on-one with the FDA.
When ISCT was formed and ASBMT were formed, we realized that if we started to write standards, we were going to have a legal exposure, which we didn't want to have. So we decided that we were going to have to spin off a third organization, which was going to be structured differently and was going to be cooperative with ISCT and ASBMT, was going to have certain legal protections. And so that's how we started with the organization of FACT.
We got together, and I think the establishment of FACT, which was a merger of ISCT and ASBMT as our parents, and the development of a program which accredited everything from the collection to the processing to the treatment of patients, was probably one of the most gratifying initiatives that we have had in our field. It was the leaders of our field who were committed, and we worked together, and it was lots of back and forth and lots of negotiation, and nobody was always ever totally happy with what we did, but in the end, we could all live with the standards we developed, which were all raised at improving the quality of care of our transplant patients.
And we actually had cooperation and interest from the major centers, and because the major centers that really are the thought leaders in the field chose to participate, everyone came along.
Well, anybody that has spent any amount of time with E.J. Spall, and particularly surrounding projects that she believes in, knows that no matter how insurmountable whatever the endeavor might seem, that it's a whole lot more likely you're going to be able to accomplish that impossible task than turn her down. And so I think one of the driving features or driving forces for FACT's success clearly is EJ's vision and her passion and her drive and her complete belief that we could do this.
And in those early days when we didn't have a lot of help, I think everything that got done, in fact, got done at about 10 times the speed I thought was humanly possible and about 1/10 as fast as EJ thought was absolutely necessary.
I don't really remember the first meeting. I remember the first meetings. They all were interminably long. They lasted 6 to 8 hours. This was very much a working board in which we all were working initially to create standards, and really under the guidance of Phyllis Workington, who was arguably the only one who really knew what she was doing in this sort of endeavor to try to assimilate standards in something that might mirror an accreditation program. Things that were most notable about those board meetings, though, was the commitment and the passion that all of the board members brought to the discussions. And bear in mind, we all became very fast friends and colleagues. Strongest steel perhaps being tempered by hottest fire. And so we were pushing this forward, all believed in it. And we had these really wonderful, but sometimes perhaps silly arguments over minor details and how they might affect facilities and our colleagues and, again, the patients that we took care of. So it was really an endeavor of audacity and passion, I would say.
I think that a lot of the issues originally with FACT would have been just getting the laboratory and the clinical side to work together, because in the transplant programs, the clinicians really controlled the whole process. They controlled the direction of the transplant programs. The laboratory was the tail of the dog. And so I think a lot of the original meetings were the laboratory people just sitting back listening to the clinical people argue.
You get people who are independent thinkers, and you put them all in the same room, and they're not all going to agree. I think we saw that when we were first writing the standards. And as we were sitting around at these various meetings, because then we didn't do it so much by conference call, we did it by sitting at meetings, looking at each other. Everybody said, well, the way we do our CD34 is this way, and so we have to have standards would say that. And somebody says, oh no, I do it this way over here. And so you get a lot of contention between people.
And how do you write standards for this business? And everybody has their own cell processing. So we said, you have to write a standard based on quality. You have to develop a quality program, and you have to assess what you're doing in the laboratory. And that was the way to write standards, not to tell people that they plug A into B and do C, because everybody's processings were different.
There's a very basic difference between regulations and standards. And a lot of people don't really understand this. Regulations are the things that you have to do, and that's what the FDA does. And they do as good a job of it as they possibly can. Because number one, they have an impossible job. It's totally impossible for them to write regulations to cover every single thing that can possibly go wrong in order to protect the public safety. Where standards, which are written by the professionals within the field, are written from the point of view of protection of the patients, protection of the science, and the development of what you use to treat your patients. And especially at first, people were very resentful of the standards and the way the standards were written, because the fact standards are a checklist sort, which we were very concrete people. You know, it was a lot of it was driven by the way laboratories were operated. So the laboratory was sort of the most organized aspect, and sort of collection was behind that, and the clinical area was a little bit more amorphous, and it was harder to organize. But as professionals within the field, we felt as if we had to write attainable goals, minimal goals, but attainable goals, and then we had to help our colleagues go there.
You know, the challenge to a standard-setting organization is to require just the right amount of detail in your standards so they don't become onerous. So we're all concerned that we can regulate ourselves to death. We can make things so difficult that it really impairs innovation in the field. And so it's finding that sort of sweet spot in terms of setting standards that to demonstrate quality, but not block innovation or advances in the field.
In the initial meeting in Omaha, where we presented standards to anybody who was interested to listen, the initial training course, so to speak, I had the pleasure of delivering the clinical standards because the clinician who was supposed to do that was ill. And so at sort of the last minute, I was asked to stand up and give this presentation. And my recollection of that particular session is that we didn't even have the 35 millimeter Kodachrome slides. We used the celluloid overheads, which clearly dates the whole process, I suppose, to more than 2 decades ago. And so we were going fairly swimmingly along the presentation of the standards until we hit the one where we had decided that the people involved with standard development from the ASBMT, I thought it was a good idea that programs ought to do at least 10 patients for accreditation for autologous transplants and 10 for allogeneic blood or marrow transplantation. There was one irascible clinician in the audience who stood up and threw down at that point, saying there was absolutely no data, that 10 should be the number, and that really we ought to leave it open to anybody who could meet the standards. Now, mind you, even in those early days, there were data in other fields that doing higher volumes was something that led programs to be better and to have better outcomes, but it was true. We didn't have any data in those times. And 10 was one of those were one of those hours-long discussions that we had as a board to try to come to the right number, and we thought it would be the best standard. Having no answer for this irascible clinician, I just looked at him and asked him if he liked his mother. And he paused for a minute and said, yeah, well, I like her pretty much. And I said, well, doctor, would you have your mother go to a facility that did less than 10 procedures a year of this type? And that pretty much quelled the discussion, and thereafter it became known as the MAMA test. And so for many of the standards we developed, if we didn't have data, they had to pass the MAMA test.
I was in Colorado, and we incorporated there, and then Phyllis and I were using our own offices and Xeroxing, and finally we got at Omaha to establish the home office, I think a year after we incorporated. But we didn't really have a staff or any serious infrastructure. It was just us and our own initiatives. I remember careening around in a taxi cab with Adrian G. Xeroxing the first draft of standards for one of our meetings. And we just, it was fun, but very, very informal.
In the beginning, this was very much a do-it-yourself operation, and we all had different jobs, and we shared the jobs. And there was one time when it was EJ's job to take the minutes for the FACT meeting. Well, just so happened that she was going on vacation down to the Virgin Islands right after the meeting, so she took the minutes and put them in her backpack, and somehow, going from the tender to the boat, she dropped the backpack and it went boom, straight into the ocean. So at our next FACT meeting, we all stood around and looked at each other and said, does anybody remember what we did at the last meeting? Because we didn't have any minutes.
EJ tapped me because I had a little company at the time, and she thought I knew something about finances, which really wasn't true. And but I came up with a business plan where we would, in fact, have a registration fee. I can't remember exactly. It was $8,000 or $10,000. Before you did anything, you had to register, and that was to give us the cash to get the whole organization going, and that worked. And the big day for me was when I think we had about 10 people or 10 groups that had already committed now to pay their registration fee, and we could actually hire some people and make this happen.
Our experiences in recruiting inspectors were highly variable, and I think we had a little bit of an easier time among the folks that had been involved in the laboratory aspects of stem cell transplantation because they were more used to having standards and regulation and so forth. Among the clinicians, there were folks that were very reluctant to get involved. This was yet another drain on people's time, very busy clinicians who were trying to pursue academic careers and had a great need to perform research and publish and teach and do the traditional things that one does in order to get promoted. On the other hand, there was initially a very small, maybe zealous, but committed group of people. And as we began to have inspections and as people began to see the benefits of the accreditation process, it became notably easier. One of the really quite smart things that Linda Miller and Phyllis Workington did initially was to recommend that we open up all of the training sessions for the facilities to potential inspectors for free. And if they would come and go through these courses and then get trained to be an inspector, we wouldn't charge them for that opportunity. There was a high degree of curiosity, and so we had quite a large number of people attend those sessions. Many of, by the way, never became inspectors. They just wanted to know what was going on, and then some, of course, wanted to prepare their facilities. And I think as they learned more about it, they learned more about the intent and commitment, the numbers swelled to some degree, although we never have enough.
The other thing that I think is really seminal about FACT is it's made up of a group of people who are very public spirited. I mean, the fact that you have all these inspectors working to better the field, free time, they're doing it on their own. I think this is a wonderful organization that is testament to the fact that in the whole medical and research community, there are a lot of people who just want to help others and make the world a better place.
We got a cadre of experts, clinicians, laboratory people, leaders in the field to become inspectors and to not only develop the standards, which was quite a labor intensive process, but to then go out and do the inspections, to have chairmen of stem cell transplant departments doing this. And all of them, almost all of them, were on board by the time we convinced everyone this was a good thing. And so you were really being reviewed by people who had such expertise that it became, I think, acceptable to all.
Your first inspection is always a learning process for yourself, both in terms of doing the inspection. But I also find that I learn things. Every center I go, I learn how they approach problems that we face in our own center. And I've actually picked up good ideas that I've taken home to our program. Again, as we've tried to do these inspections, we've tried to make them collegial and with the goal of improving the quality in the center, not stopping them from doing transplants. We don't want to be a barrier to people delivering transplant care, but we do want to make sure that they do it with high quality and safety for the patients.
As an inspector, you learn a lot when you go out and see other people's facilities. There's a lot of intelligence out there, a lot of experience in cell processing around the country, and it's really great to go out and see these people, talk with them, and address the problems. It could be something simple. How often do you wash your floors, or how do you deal with housekeeping at your institution? I have a problem with my institution. How would you solve that? Or it could be more detailed. I see you're involved with some very advanced cell processing. How did you establish that? These are the collegiality aspects of the FACT inspection process.
But then the other thing is, FACT has been very collegial and supportive. And when you go in to do your inspections, by and large, people thank you at the end. And they're not just doing that because they want you to write a good report about them, but when inspectors go in, I always learn something. And I go away with copies of forms and procedures and ideas, and then these are cooperated, are passed between various centers. So that while we are contentious, we're still very, very collaborative, and people like Phyllis and Richard and Scott and Keith and Adrian, who give freely of their time and put much more into this than they've ever been compensated for.
I think one of the first most important things that happened, in fact, was to start to hire some help. And maybe this is an amusing story of a board meeting, but when we first did our first 5 inspections, it was up to me to do all the reviews and do the reports. I brought my reports. I had spent 5 or 6 days and nights doing this. I brought all of this to the board meeting, and we started to go through some of the reports, and several board members just threw up their hands. This is not adequate. This is not good enough. We can't do this. Programs need to know more detail. And I just said, I quit. I can't do this anymore. I've spent 5 days and nights doing this, and I'm out of energy. And I think it was Richard O'Reilly who said, maybe we need to hire some help. So our first employee, Linda, is still with us, actually, in fact, and that's an amazing feat. Linda has really grown up a lot in the organization and has really now taken the role of CEO and is doing a really wonderful job at it. I can't say enough good things about the staff as a whole. We have coordinators who work full-time doing this kind of work, and they are steady, and they try to be consistent, and they're fair. And the thing about them that sets them apart is that each one, when they get a program assigned to them, they adopt that program, and they become the advocate for that program. When they present the program to the accreditation committee, they are heart and soul part of that program, and they want to protect them and make sure they get a fair hearing and that everybody's understanding that program.
Policing the field is not about what FACT is about. I think from the very beginning, with our first discussions with the clinical ASBMT board, who were throwing rocks at us to say, I don't want someone coming in and telling me what to do. Our goal has been raise the bar, help everyone. We don't want to police. We want to look at your program, and if things aren't good, we want to help. The mantra of FACT is if someone needed an SOP and you could provide it, do it. If someone we've had many training courses for sites and for inspectors to teach the field how we want to do this. We've been embracing and collaborative, and there's really never been a sense that you can't pass. We'll show you how to pass, and we have passed the vast majority of sites that have applied for FACT accreditation because we'll go back and help and provide the documentation and give the expertise. And we've helped a lot of programs who needed more space, who didn't have adequate support when their administration saw what they needed. We've actually been very helpful in improving what investigators need to do transplant medicine.
The people from FACT are people with a mission, and they really want things to happen right and happen well, and they really want to protect patients and see that science advances and that people can talk with each other in a way which moves everyone forward.
And with that team and really Alan taking a lot of the day-to-day burden of running the organization off us so that we could really move the field was just a major step forward, and it was wonderful.
That was huge for us. And these people have really become, they're so much a part of FACT that I think they are the ones that people recognize as FACT. They're the ones who do help out the committees, they interact with all the volunteers, and they make sure that programs are interesting for education and that the IT system works and that everybody knows how to use it. We actually got a lot of free contributions from everybody. But certainly we had a little space at the University of Nebraska before we actually had to rent an office. Adrian did his standards on his own time at Kinko's. And we all had secretaries and all had phone calls and things like that our institutions contributed to the development of FACT. Otherwise, there really have not been voluntary contributions or donations. We don't have a foundation. It's been an interesting structure to work around for the organization.
Initial discussions about whether to get into accreditation of umbilical cord blood banks were colorful, to say the least. This was at a time where we had just barely become solvent as an organization. So we're talking now, I guess, this is in the late 1990s and early 2000s. We were just barely solvent as an organization. NetCourt as an entity had approached FACT about developing joint standards, and different from JC, had wanted us to be the global accrediting organization for cord blood, which was flattering and a testament, I think, to how people viewed that we had performed in the arena of blood and marrow transplantation. But the resources required to be able to pull something like that off were hardly in our grasp. And to think about developing international training programs for facilities and inspectors and really to even the travel associated with these kinds of very infrequent inspections was daunting, not to mention that none of the cord banks had any money. And so that we had the very real world issue of developing a business plan where the constituencies that we wanted to sell to couldn't pay. And so there were some on the board, including me, who felt like this was folly again, that we shouldn't get into it because it had the potential to bankrupt the organization or at least retard what was our principal focus. I think that, again, giving credit to E.J. Spall and Phyllis Workington, a common sense prevailed, and they recognized that if we really were going to be the global leaders in accreditation of cellular therapies, it was not only a good idea but critical for us to be to lead that initiative with NetCord and developing the FACT NetCord standards.
And so we were working closely with our friends in Europe, NetCord, who was an organization of true experts, cord blood bankers, Pablo Rubenstein from New York, but then many of the leaders of the big banks in Europe, in Dusseldorf, Milano, London. And so we got together with them and actually put our programs together and took their expertise with, which was great, but really not refined enough to do accreditation. And we brought in Phyllis and FACT's expertise at actually making an inspection program. And then we drafted the first edition of the FACT NetCord standards, which were then comprehensive and dealing with every aspect of collection, processing, testing, and release of cord blood units. It became a very well-known accreditation required by NMDP, and even now that the cord blood banks are licensed and the FDA does come in and inspect them, if you are accredited by FACT, you have already complied with many, if not all, of the requirements that FDA put forth, because they actually took the FACT standards and basically based a lot of their regulation on what we had already developed.
I think the major turning point when I knew it was going to work was when facilities submitted for reaccreditation. It wasn't, I mean, this is a very work-intensive process. It takes a lot of time, arguably expensive to do. And for facilities to undergo this inspection and then come back 3 years later and resubmit for accreditation said to me, and I think to the rest of the board, that we actually were doing something meaningful, or at least that they perceived was meaningful. And so once we started to see those reapplications, that I pretty much knew we were going to be okay.
Oh, FACT has been tremendously successful, much more than we can ever believe. And when the third-party payers started saying, programs have to be FACT accredited in order for us to reimburse for these procedures, I think that was, when that happened, I think people looked around at each other and I said, I think we've made it over the hump.
So again, this has slowly evolved to be the national standard for quality that is both required for to be a center of excellence in various insurance networks, but it's also a measure of quality for the U.S. News and World Report rankings for cancer centers. FACT accreditation is a key aspect of that rating system.
To the point where now every major transplant program in the United States gets accredited. I think the U.S. News and World Report putting us in the non-medical media to make sure that our program was respected and had value. The insurance industry coming on board. So I think those are all things that have been very gratifying and underscored the benefit of our approach.
As we request approval from various insurance companies as a transplant program, the first question they're going to have is, are you FACT accredited? And so the FACT is a very important program for the clinical and the laboratory and the collection facilities, because you can't do anything for patient care in this country that's going to be involved with insurance coverage unless you're FACT accredited.
Going forward, I think the challenges are going to be to expand what we do. Gene therapy is going to come back in, new ways of processing cells and doing things to them, and getting more basic scientists involved, I think, is key. And then there's the regional issue. I think that China offers a huge opportunity to encompass a whole new group of interested people in the need for regulation and just doing things right.
FACT, in partnership with ASBMT in particular, is going to need looking forward to help identify appropriate outcomes that are important to patients, that are meaningful, that are measurable, and that are actionable. And I think we can provide a leadership role in that. I would argue that the last 20 years have really provided a model for other areas of medicine about how to self-regulate, about how to set standards, about how to identify processes that lead to quality outcomes. And we now have evidence, largely from the studies that have been conducted in Europe, that by applying these standards and these accreditation processes, patients do better.
Personally, for me, the most rewarding thing is to see all of the really bright leaders in this field, to be able to work with them, to see them continue to advance the field and be able to prosper in the same environment with some standards and some quality initiatives and other things that have been useful for really improving the field, improving quality, improving patient care over the years. I really feel privileged to have worked with these people. This is a really amazing group of leaders, of innovators, of just outstanding scientists and clinicians.
What we didn't anticipate, but I think in retrospect happened, is that we not only didn't inhibit innovation, we facilitated it. And the reason we facilitated it is we, through the very hard work of all of our colleagues who helped think about the development of standards and their application and doing these accreditations, we provided a roadmap or a pathway in which best practice could be identified. So that as long as people were in those general parameters of the processes that we all agreed were really critically important, then we knew we were headed in the right direction, and that actually facilitated innovation rather than inhibited it.
We, I think first and foremost, have developed a set of guidelines which actually, I think, improves the quality of patient care. And we've helped our patients, and really that's what we're about. We've been embraced by the global community. Both the academic researchers and the clinicians understand that we bring value. The insurance industry, the FDA, I think that by all objective measures, we are considered to have improved the field.